All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in American history, Brown versus the Board of Education. But this isn't just a dusty old history lesson. Nope. This is the story of a legal earthquake that completely reshaped the nation, and its aftershocks? We're still feeling them today.
So to really get the scale of that earthquake, you have to understand the ground it was standing on. Before 1954, the law of the land across much of America was built on this one single, powerful, and deeply, deeply flawed idea.
And that idea was called separate but equal. It was locked into law by the Supreme Court way back in 1896 in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And what it said was basically states could legally segregate people by race just as long as the separate facilities they provided were equal. This right here, this was the legal backbone of Jim Crow America.
But what if that whole premise is a lie? What if the very act of separating people, especially kids, makes them unequal by default? That was the revolutionary question that a team of civil rights lawyers, led by the legendary Thurgood Marshall, set out to prove in court. Their goal? To tear that whole system down, right from its foundation.
Now, this legal fight, it wasn't just happening in fancy courtrooms in Washington, D.C. It was being driven by totally ordinary people who showed the most extraordinary courage, staring down some pretty immense pressure. The case gets its name from a man named Oliver Brown. He was a welder, a pastor in Topeka, Kansas. His own daughter described him as just an ordinary man. And his reason for joining this lawsuit was incredibly simple. He just wanted his little girl, Linda, to be able to go to the good school in their own neighborhood, a school that was only 7 blocks away, but was for white children only.
So what did separate but equal actually mean for a kid like Linda Brown? Well, think about it. First, you're turned away from a school that's practically in your backyard, just 7 blocks from your front door. So instead, you have to walk 6 blocks in the opposite direction just to get to a bus stop. And then you have to ride that bus for miles across town to get to your school. That was the daily grind, the real tangible injustice of the whole system.
And the price for challenging this system? It was terrifyingly high. You see, the Brown case wasn't just about the Browns. It actually rolled 5 different lawsuits from all over the country into one. In South Carolina, one of the plaintiffs, a man named Harry Briggs, was immediately fired from his job. The reverend who organized that case had his house burned to the ground. And in Virginia, the family home of a 16-year-old student organizer named Barbara Johns was also torched. This wasn't some abstract legal debate. This was a life-threatening fight.
So after years of arguments and fighting, the case finally made its way to the highest court in the land. And on a day in May of 1954, the 9 justices delivered a verdict that, and this is no exaggeration, would echo for generations to come.
The decision was 9-0, unanimous. Just think about the power of that for a second. In a country that was literally tearing itself apart over this issue, the 9 most powerful judges in America spoke with one single unified voice. They left absolutely no room for doubt, no wiggle room, no crack for legal dissent.
And this right here, this is the line that changed everything. Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for the court, put it as plainly as possible. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And with that one sentence, bam! 58 years of legal precedent from Plessy versus Ferguson just wiped off the books.
So what was the legal logic? Well, the court pointed to the 14th Amendment, specifically its promise of equal protection under the law. But they went a step further. They argued that the very act of separating children just because of their race creates a feeling of inferiority. It was as much a psychological argument as a legal one, that this segregation does damage to their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone.
But, winning the argument is one thing. Actually making it happen is a whole other story. A year later, the court had to issue another ruling, which we call Brown 2, to give instructions on how to do it. And it ordered states to desegregate with, and this is the now infamous phrase, all deliberate speed. That little bit of ambiguity would turn out to be a massive, massive loophole.
And that phrase, all deliberate speed, well, it was the only opening the opposition needed. Instead of moving to comply with the ruling, the South just erupted in what came to be known as massive resistance.
The term massive resistance actually came from Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia. See how he framed it? He cast the Supreme Court's decision not as a win for civil rights, but as an attack on states' rights, even calling it the most serious blow ever struck against them.
On the floor of Congress, a representative from Mississippi gave the day of the ruling a chilling nickname, Black Monday. This wasn't just political disagreement.
This was a declaration of war against the court itself.
And that spirit of defiance just got louder and louder. And maybe no one captured it more famously than Alabama Governor George Wallace in 1963, when he stood and promised, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." This is the same guy who would later physically stand in a doorway to try and block black students from entering the University of Alabama.
And this wasn't just talk. It was a highly organized political strategy. You had 101 Southern congressmen signing something called the Southern Manifesto to denounce the ruling. Some states passed laws to shut down their entire public school systems rather than integrate. They used public tax money to fund private all-white schools called segregation academies. And groups called citizens' councils waged economic war, getting people fired from their jobs if they supported desegregation.
So, while Brown was this huge, monumental legal victory, the reality on the ground was way more complicated. And that brings us to the legacy of the decision today, and what you might call its unfinished promise. One of the really tragic and honestly often overlooked consequences of all this was this number, 38,000. That's roughly how many highly experienced black teachers and principals across the South lost their jobs. As schools started to integrate, many white school districts just flat out refused to hire them to teach white kids.
And this gets to the real heart of the Brown legacy today. The ruling delivered a knockout blow to what's called de jure segregation. That's segregation that exists because of a law. But what it couldn't do was eliminate de facto segregation. Segregation that happens just by fact or by circumstance, driven by things like housing patterns and wealth gaps. And that, well, that's still our biggest challenge.
How big a challenge? Well, look at this. Even today, right now, more than a third of all students in the United States go to what are considered highly segregated schools. Schools where over 75% of the kids come from a single racial or ethnic group. So yeah, the legacy is complicated. On the one hand, Brown laid the legal groundwork for pretty much every major civil rights victory that came after it, and even for disability rights laws. But on the other hand, while most Americans say they approve of the decision, we are deeply, deeply divided on how to actually create integrated schools. And when you hear some advocates today describe the debates over things like DEI or book bans as a kind of retro-massive resistance, they're pointing back to this very history, organized opposition to change in our schools.
Which really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Brown v. Board of Education was an undeniable, world-changing legal victory. It declared on the highest authority what America should be. But looking around today, 70 years down the road, can we honestly say that its promise of an equal education for every single child has truly been fulfilled?